Hello everyone, I am Sanket Singh and welcome back to my channel. So guys, in this particular video, we are going to talk about a roadmap for Spring Boot. This video is going to talk about what are the different set of topics that you need to learn if you want to master Spring Boot for backend development. Also, all of these topics that I'm going to talk about, we are covering in our upcoming Spring Boot Bootcamp, which is going to be a 8-week bootcamp in which we are going to make projects with Spring Boot and going to start from the very beginner level of Spring Boot and reach to an advanced level. Right. So do check out the bootcamp. And if you have any confusion regarding what all topics will be taught, please watch this particular video till the very last. You will be able to understand what all different topics we are actually covering, right? We are going to take a very deep dive in throughout the course in each and every single aspect of Spring Boot, because Spring Boot is a major framework. There are a lot of nuances that you need to take care about while writing code in Spring Boot. Right, so it's going to be a fun journey, right? And I believe this video is going to be useful for all those people who are aspiring to actually use Spring Boot for their backend development journey, or because you already know that in a lot of MNCs and a lot of startups, Java is the language that they use for backend engineering, and Spring Boot is I would say, one of the most widely used frameworks in the industry as well. So if you want to be industry ready, this video is going to be really useful for you. So without any further delay, let's just start. But before starting the video, if you have not yet subscribed to the channel, please do consider subscribing to the channel. We are going to bring some awesome content on this particular channel. And if you want to check out the Spring Boot course, do check out the description section. You will find all the details and the link to the course there. So let's just start. So guys, let's just start our discussion on the Spring Boot roadmap. Again, specifying that the fact that all of the topics that I'm going to discuss in this roadmap is something that I have myself figured out is going to be the ideal way in which you can learn Spring Boot. And all of these topics we are also covering in our Spring Boot live bootcamp. So if you have not yet checked it out, do check out the link in the description section. So let's just start. So in order to understand things around Spring Boot, the first thing that you have to start with is basics of Java. Of course, Spring Boot is a Java framework. So all the important basics of Java, that is how do you write basic programming code in Java using, let's say, for loops, using if else, all of these important topics are going to be expected out of you. If you know a few another advanced topics of Java, for example, streams and everything, then that is going to be an added advantage. But it is not going to hinder your learning in the initial stages of Spring Boot. You can eventually also learn all of the advanced concepts of latest Java. But apart from Java, one of the most important things that you need to keep in mind is going to be object-oriented programming. Okay. Now, because Java is an object-oriented language, concepts of object-oriented programming, encapsulation, abstraction, polymorphism, all of these topics are going to be extremely important if you want to actually write good Spring Boot code and if you want to understand Spring Boot code as well. Because in the initial state, you will be reading a lot of code because you'll be referring to maybe some courses, some documentation. At that point of time, reading code is going to be your habit. And if you want to read Java code and understand it well, OOPS is going to be something that you need. And then if you have good knowledge around basic OOPS, you should start learning solid principles. Yes, this topic is important for generally for low-level design understanding. But because of the fact that Spring Boot heavily relies on Java concepts, you will see solid principles being used very heavily in Spring Boot projects, right? And specifically dependency inversion, right? There is a concept called as dependency injection, using which we actually implement dependency inversion. But in order to understand how dependency injection works, you need to understand dependency inversion. And again, this is part of solid principles, right? So understanding of solid principle is going to be very important. So you need to understand what is single responsibility principle, open close principle, Liskov substitution principle, interface segregation principle, and dependency inversion, right? Then you need to start a basic understanding of how exactly a backend application works, how exactly the basic backend architecture works. You need to understand what is client. You need to understand what is server, how exactly client server communication happens. You need to understand what is a monolith project, what is a microservice oriented project. Then you need to start an understanding of MVC architecture. MVC stands for models, views, and controllers, right? You need to have a basic understanding of how exactly models, views, and controller work. Why do you need an MVC architecture? What is the benefit of it? And then you need to have understanding of REST APIs as well. You need to first of all understand what is an API. Then you need to understand all the important parts of the REST convention, that what is status code, what is a resource, how the URLs of a REST API works, so on and so forth. Once you are good with it, you are in a good shape to actually start understanding of Spring, right? So you should start an understanding of what is the Spring framework, right? And how exactly Spring Boot derives from the Spring framework, right? So what are the features of the Spring framework, and then what exactly Spring Boot provides you? And in order to understand both of these things, you need to have a basic understanding of dependency injection, which depends on solid principle, right? So I've specifically mentioned dependency injection here as well, because in a lot of interviews, dependency injection based questions are asked. And to be very honest, if you're coming from a world of, let's say, MERN stack, where you write basic plain JS code with Express.js, you might not have actually interacted with any dependency injection kind of a scenario. So this can be new for a lot of people. That's why I am expecting you to have a good understanding of it. As I then mentioned, that you need to have a understanding of what is Spring application context, what is the Spring framework, and how exactly Spring Boot comes out of it. Then there is a very simple tool called as Spring Initializer, using which you can actually set up your Spring Boot project. You can go to the Spring Initializer website, or if you're using any modern IDE, then also you will get the access of the Spring Initializer. Once done, you will be able to set up a basic Spring Boot project. But once you start setting up a basic Spring Boot project, you will hear a lot of things like Maven, Gradle, Bazel, and all of these things. What are these? These are actually build systems. So you need to have an understanding of why there exists build system, why do you need a build system, and then you need to actually master maybe any one of these three. Or if you want to have access to anything else, you can actually go that. I believe having a understanding of Gradle and Maven is going to be more than enough. If you want to explore Bazel, this is a Google technology, so you can explore Bazel. And in the Spring Boot cohort, the live bootcamp, I'm also covering Bazel, and a lot of projects we are going to make with Maven and Gradle as well. So I've covered you all of there. Okay. Then you need to start an understanding of what is annotations, right? Generally in basic Java, you must have only understood the @override annotation, but there are few more annotations that will start coming up once you start setting up your own Spring Boot project. So what is annotations, and what is the Lombok library, how it actually helps us to manage all of these annotations. Once done, you will be able to having an understanding of the basic plain Spring Boot project. And on the top of it, you need to actually start developing your code. Before you start developing your code, your knowledge of MVC is going to come into the picture, and you need to have an understanding of what is controllers from MVC. But apart from controller, you need to understand what is services, what is repository, how exactly these three called as a component in Spring Boot. All of these things you need to understand, because for your code segregation and code planning, understanding of service layer, controller layer, repository layer, all of this is important. And for each and every layer, there are dedicated annotations given by Spring Boot. Then once you start setting up your basic code, you will realize that a lot of things Spring is automatically doing behind the scenes, and you will encounter something called as Spring Beans, which is actually handling a lot of things for your object initialization and your overall code initialization. Then having understanding of basic Spring Boot architecture, you need to start setting up REST API for yourself. And for that, you have REST controllers and REST templates, right? Then you need to have an access to something called as DTO, that is called as a data transfer object. What is data transfer object? Why do you need it? Is something that you need to understand. And once you start getting an understanding of DTO, you need to get an understanding of adapters, that what is an adapter? Why do you need it? And this technically directly comes from the adapter design pattern. This is the best part about Spring Boot, that the more understanding of Spring Boot you start getting, a lot of design patterns you eventually understand also, because they have a direct application inside Spring Boot, right? Now, post that, you need to start having access, or I would say understanding of databases, right? So specifically, you need to have understanding of what is a database. You can maybe start with an RDBMS, right? Like MySQL or PostgreSQL, right? You need to have understanding of how to write SQL queries and everything. And once you have this basic understanding of databases, you need to start understanding that how you can actually integrate database with your Spring Boot project. For that, you need to have an understanding of what is a repository, what is a data access object, right? A lot of people generally use both of them, right? And how you can use them to define your entity layer or the persistence layer, right? Now you can see specifically I have mentioned databases here as well, that you need to have an understanding of what is SQL, what is NoSQL, how exactly the queries work. I believe if you can start with any of the one of the database, let's say MySQL only, you can get started with Spring Boot. And if you're using RDBMS, then how exactly transaction management is done, These basic things you need to have an understanding too. And once you have understanding of databases and once you have understanding of what is the repository layer and everything, then you can actually get started with your persistence layer in Spring Boot. In the persistence layer of Spring Boot, you need to have an understanding of what is exactly JDBC, right? On the top of JDBC, you have the Hibernate ORM. What is an ORM? You need to have an understanding of what is an ORM. ORM is Object Relational Mapper. And then on the top of Hibernate, you have Spring Data JPA. How exactly it actually helps us to query our database. Then you need to have an understanding of how exactly you write JPA queries, or sometimes if you want to write raw SQL queries, how can you do that? Or maybe if you want to just write Hibernate queries, how exactly you do that? All of this is actually going to help you to integrate your database and actually query on your database, which is going to help you to set up the persistence layer in Spring Boot. And once you know that how exactly you set up the database and make basic queries, you need to start getting an understanding of how exactly you design a database. Designing a database means if you're using, let's say, RDBMS, you need to have understanding of relational mapping. What is one-to-one mapping? What is many-to-one mapping? What is one-to-many mapping? This kind of a mapping understanding you need to get. And once you understand how this mapping works, you need to understand how to implement this mapping in Spring Boot using mapped superclass, table per class, single class or joint table class. All of these things you need to get understanding, because these are the different available classes that you are actually going to use in Spring Boot to implement these kind of relational mapping. Once done, you will be having a strong fundamental in actually designing database as well. And then for validations, because now you will be actually storing data inside your database, so some validations you can actually put on the database layer or the business layer. But apart from that, there is something called as REST controller advices, using which you can also set up your validations, right? So start exploring REST controller advices, right? Post that you need to have few more understanding about your database architecture, like, because when you are actually querying on your database, there are different fetch modes in which you can fetch the data. One is called as lazy loading, one is called as eager loading. Understand what is both of them, understand when you need one, when you need the other one, right? And then because you will be having a bunch of relational mapping, how exactly you are going to set up the cascade types. Is it going to be persist? Is it going to be merge? Is it going to be detach? So on and so forth, right? All of this together is going to not only give you a good understanding about databases, but also good understanding about how exactly you integrate databases with Spring Boot. After that, you need to start having an understanding of Spring security, and using Spring security, how you can set up authentication, authorization, how you can do token based authentication, how exactly you can set up HTTP only cookies, how can you secure user password. All of these things you need to have an understanding about, because this is going to help you to implement your authentication and authorization layer. Apart from that, a lot of time you might need task scheduling. You might to schedule a task that might occur after some time, or recurring, I would say, some task execution you need. So Spring scheduled task is going to actually help you there. So start understanding of this as well. And then you need to start getting an understanding of caches, that why do you need cache? When do you need cache? And how you can integrate caches in your Spring Boot project. Maybe using Redis, you can use, let's say, Redis cache. And in order to integrate Redis cache, you can use Spring Data Redis as well, right? Now, all of these things we are actually covering in the Spring Boot cohort. And in order to make sure that you have some advanced knowledge around backend development as well, we have also integrated a few more things. This is not mandatory for you to have understanding of Spring Boot, but if you have understanding of this, your backend knowledge, backend engineering knowledge is going to be enhanced. For example, how can you integrate Elasticsearch to do an open text search, right? So there is a library called as Spring Data Open Search, using which you can actually integrate Elasticsearch or open search like technologies. For example, let's say you want to search for a product, but the search query can be an open text query. How can you actually do that, right? So try to integrate something like this. Try to integrate caches there. Apart from that, try to understand the deployment of your Spring Boot project. How can you actually containerize your Spring Boot project using Docker? How can you actually deploy your project on AWS EC2, right? All of these things you can try to understand, okay? And then apart from this, there are a few miscellaneous topics also that I have actually listed. For example, how can you manage good logging in your Spring Boot project? What is different logging levels? How can you do distributed logging? Save all your logs so that later it can be reconciled. How can you set up monitoring for your Spring Boot project, right? Apart from that, try to understand continuous integration, continuous deployment, the CI/CD pipelining when you are actually doing the deployment. How can you set up a CI/CD pipeline for your Spring Boot project, right? Try to understand how you can do pagination based queries. How can you do local tunnel deployment? All of these are few miscellaneous topics that you don't need to immediately learn. But yes, if you will learn, you will be having a good understanding of how exactly backend works with Spring Boot. And all of these topics we have actually also integrated in our Spring Boot live project. right? Apart from that, one more additional topic that you can do is understanding how exactly you set up web sockets with Spring Boot, right? Using WebSocket, maybe you can make a project of messaging app, right? You can make a small messaging app and then understand how exactly WebSockets work in Spring Boot. So you can see a bunch of topics are there. And for understanding of all of this, there are a few prerequisites. For example, good understanding of databases, good understanding of networking, right? Good understanding of version control system like Git. All of these things are also important, and all of these prerequisites, including the basic Java, solid principles, oops in Java, databases, network, Git, all of these prerequisite topics I have also included in the Spring Boot cohort. Apart from that, we are going to make two projects in the Spring Boot cohort, right? One project is going to be the e-commerce application, right? Another project is going to be a payment wallet. So these are going to be two big projects that we are actually going to integrate and actually going to make in the cohort. If you are learning Spring Boot yourself, you can think about any other project as well. But I believe these two projects are going to be extremely useful for all those people who are going to enroll in the Spring Boot cohort, to make sure that they have a good understanding of the Spring Boot concepts and they're able to implement these concepts into real life projects as well. And I believe one thing you should always keep in mind, that Spring Boot is a world in itself, right? It's not a micro framework like, let's say, Flask or Express, where a lot of things you're dependent on third party. Most of the things Spring Boot comes with itself, right? And it's a very major framework, so there are a lot of moving things, right? The performance of Spring Boot is very good. Like if you do a performance check, or let's say you do a load testing of your Spring Boot application with, let's say, an Express application, you will realize that the overall performance of Spring Boot is way more than a Express.js application. In order to test that, we have also integrated lessons of testing, right? So there are dedicated lessons on unit testing and load testing in the cohort, in the live cohort, right? We are going to do load testing. I'll actually show you that if, let's say, 1000 requests per second come on your particular server, how your server is reacting, how many requests are failing, how the overall load on your RAM looks like. All of these things we are going to do. Apart from that, unit testing, how exactly unit testing goes on, how do you do testing in your application, everything we are also going to discuss in your Spring Boot live bootcamp. And if you are not going through a bootcamp, or let's say you want to learn yourself, I would highly recommend you to actually learn testing, that how you can do testing, maybe using something like JUnit for unit testing, and something like, let's say, for load testing, you can use something like Bombardier or maybe some other package or library. But I believe these topics are going to be very important and very good for your understanding of Spring Boot. Now, from here, if you want to go, let's say, slightly more advanced and you want to understand advanced backend concept, then sky is the limit. For example, you can start learning how you can exactly integrate gRPC in your Spring Boot project. I am going to talk about gRPC in the cohort, that how you can actually integrate gRPC in your Spring Boot project. Apart from that, there will be discussion on message queues, right? How you can actually integrate message queues when message queues comes into the picture. So in the cohort, we are going to talk about Kafka, that what is Kafka, what are Kafka topics, how partitioning works in Kafka topic. All of these things we are also going to talk about in the cohort, right? So you can see there are different more concepts that we are going to actually learn in the cohort. So what I would highly recommend you guys to do is to actually go through this whole roadmap once yourself, right? I'll actually, let's do one thing. I'll actually show you the cohort website. Okay. So you can go to courses.algocamp.io/learn. You can go to live backend in Spring Boot, and you can see we are talking about Java refresher, solid principles, how backend architecture works, Maven, Gradle, build system, DBMS, designing your own database, database indexing, right? You can see MongoDB we are also covering, asset properties we are covering, dependency injection, Spring MVC, Tomcat server. What is a Tomcat server? Why do you need it, right? How you can actually set up your basic Spring Boot project, adapters, DTO layer, REST templates, Spring Beans, annotation. You can see all of these important topics that I talked about we are covering in the course. You can see unit testing and everything we have also covered. We are also covering how you can actually set up idempotent APIs. You can learn about what is an idempotent API, how you can set up idempotent APIs, right? We can do some we are going to do some payment system or payment gateway integration like Razorpay, right? Then all of the discussion that we are going to do in the cohort is going to be a microservice architecture oriented discussion, right? We are going to see how you can set up cron jobs. You can see a lot of things we have actually set up, right? So it's a power packed course. I would highly recommend you guys to actually go through this, or if you want to learn Spring Boot yourself, I would highly recommend you to actually go through this roadmap and start learning Spring Boot. That being said, if you enjoyed this particular video and if you enjoyed the roadmap, don't forget to hit the like button. And if you have any thoughts corresponding to this, please mention us in the comment section below. I would be happy to answer all of your questions. Till then, take care, guys. Bye bye. Have a great week ahead. I'm Sanket Singh, signing off.